Hi Wendy. Thanks for joining me today. I just wondered if you could just introduce yourself and talk about your recent book.
Hi Debbie, pleasure to talk to you. I'm a journalist by background and I write books about medical history and social history. So my current book is called Endell Street, and it's all about the story of Endell Street Military Hospital.
Brilliant. So why did Endell Street actually exist?
Endell Street was a military hospital right in the heart of London, in Covent Garden, so near to Charing Cross Hospital, Charing Cross Station, and it was run entirely by women, women doctors, women, all the women surgeons, all the cleaners, caterers, they were all women.
Oh, brilliant. So obviously the women ran it, but did they run it for the British Army, or was it?
Yeah, it was the only hospital that was run by women as part of the British Army. And it was one of the 10 biggest hospitals in the centre of London.
And we've got some of the archives in LSE Library, and one of the things that we've got is this amazing scrapbook, and you used that, didn't you, in your research for the book? Can you just describe what it's like and who put it together?
Yeah, the scrapbook is a fantastic record of what the women did at the hospital. It's a really big book, it's quite fragile, and inside it contains cuttings taken from newspapers and magazines that one of the two women who ran the hospital, Flora Murray, she pasted into the album. She wanted to keep it as a record of what the women did at the hospital. So it includes newspapers from all over the country, but even from Australia. There's one newspaper cutting from a newspaper in Sydney, Australia.
But is it quite a fragile book, or is it in quite good nick, would you say?
It's a kind of very heavy, big book. The pages are quite fragile because a lot of them, the newspaper cuttings open out, so they're folded up, and then you can unravel them. So they're all very thin paper. So it has to be very carefully looked after.
Brilliant, thank you. Because most of the hospitals finished they closed 1918 or early 1919, but Endell Street didn't. Why was that?
Endell Street was one of the few military hospitals in London that stayed open after the war, and that's because they were treating the victims of the Spanish flu pandemic.
So how long did it stay open for then?
It stayed open for another year after the war, and it closed at the end of 1919.
So were they still taking troops in, or was it a mixture of people who lived in London in the hospital?
It was a mixture. Most of the patients who came there with the flu were soldiers. There were women as well who'd been working for the British Army who came as patients, but they were treating local people too, not necessarily in beds, but they would treat the local people in their outpatients department.
Because what was going on at the end of the war, there was lots of troops moving around, wasn't there? There was Americans coming in and out of London, and London was this enormous port city. So, I mean, I suppose that would spread the disease, would it, with all this massive movement of different troops?
Yes, that's right. So we don't know absolutely for sure why the Spanish flu came at the time it did, or where it even came from, but it probably was spread initially by soldiers from America coming to Europe, bringing the flu with them. And then when the war ended and those soldiers were sent back home, then they spread it around the world. And a lot of those soldiers passed through London and brought the disease with them. So at the time of the peace was declared, that's when lots of people were out in the streets and mixing with soldiers. And of course, the flu was mixing too.
That's interesting. I mean, what could they do in the hospital? Because there wasn't things like antibiotics or penicillin then, was there, to stop some of the main effects of the flu, because it attacked the immunity system, as in the sort of antibodies that help us stop getting diseases, which is usually what antibiotics support, isn't it? So, I mean, what on earth could they do for people who had the flu in the hospital?
There wasn't really very much they could do. The flu, it was a really nasty kind of flu. It wasn't like the flu that we get coming every year. This was a particularly very nasty kind of flu. And so all they could really do was to nurse the patients, make sure that they had enough food and water, try to keep their temperature down, give them aspirin to help with the pain. But because, as you say, they didn't have any antibiotics, penicillin or anything like that, there was very little they could do. So it's really a question of trying to help the patients to fight the flu themselves as much as possible.
Do they use things like masks like we use today with COVID? I mean, do they use things like that, or hygiene rules or anything like that?
At the time, it wasn't very common for doctors to normally wear masks, but in the flu pandemic, the women doctors at Endell Street began to wear masks. So they wore masks, and the nurses did too. And they also put the patients with the flu in one particular ward. So basically, they were being quarantined. And they were really pioneering those approaches. They were one of the few military hospitals that introduced masks and segregation in the wards. And they even had a little steam machine in the courtyard where the staff would go and breathe in the steam, because they thought that would help with hygiene, but we don't really know if it had much effect at all.
I'm thinking about the staff. Did any of the staff get it? And did any of the staff die?
Yeah, very sadly, quite a lot of the staff became ill with the flu. In total, there were about 22 of the women's staff who came down with the flu, and at least 4, possibly 5 of them died from the flu.
And so was it Joan Palms? Was she one of them? Who was she?
One of the nursing orderlies, Joan Palms, she died of the flu. There were several other nurse orderlies, and there was a young woman called Helen Wilkes. She was just 18. She was a medical student. She actually died after an appendix operation, but it's possible that she caught the flu as well, and that her illness was made worse by the flu. 4 or 5 women died, and it was a very sad time for the other staff at the hospital then.
And there was an old lady who got sick called Nina Last, whose I didn't say costume, but uniform we actually have in our collection. And I think the students will have seen a photograph of it by now. So, and you've got a nice quote from her in your book describing her experience, because she left a memoir, didn't she, as well? Do you want to
Nina Last worked as in the laundry at the hospital. She was quite young, and her sister worked there too, Barbara, as a nursing assistant. And they wrote letters home describing their experience, which are absolutely wonderful. They're in the women's library. And Nina's uniform, as you say, is still kept there. And so it was a real delight for me to go there and see her uniform. And I wasn't allowed to touch it, but to actually see the uniform that she wore was absolutely amazing. I actually got to meet her granddaughter too as part of my research. But Nina and her sister Barbara both came down with the flu. They were both quite ill for a week or so. Nina recovered quite quickly. She was pretty strong, really. Her sister Barbara was never completely recovered. She was quite weak and frail afterwards. But Nina described the flu tearing through the hospital in her letters. At one point, she talked about men dying in the street like flies. And I can find her quote actually in my book. If we just look for it for a minute. She said, men died like flies in the street one moment, then 3 days later dead. It was more like a plague than influenza. And she also talked about the women staff. The women were, where is she again? Let me find it. She said, pretty young girls, quite well one day, were dead in 3 days' time from streptococcal germs, that's the throat illness, or influenza. And she said they were war-worn girls, so they'd been worn down by the war and fell an easy prey.
It's really sad, but there were patients who had it, weren't there, who recovered as well. So there's one that really struck me in your book, Vic Jones, who's quite a lively character from Australia. And I was also struck by the fact that he kept a diary of everything. You know, he liked Flora. He kept his scrapbook that his family have. And did you speak to them? Was that right? Did you contact them?
Yes, I mean, as part of writing the book, I managed to get in touch with lots of families whose grandfathers or great uncles had been treated at Endell Street. So it was amazing to get in touch with them. And some of those patients who were treated there had written letters home, which their families had kept, or had written diaries, like Vic Jones. So Vic Jones had been was an Australian soldier. He'd actually, I think, been wounded previously and recovered. But then after the war had ended, he became ill with the flu and he ended up in Endell Street. And he was there in 1919 for 3 weeks. And he wrote a diary describing his time there. As you say, it was very upbeat. He recovered pretty quickly because he was spending quite a lot of time going on outings from the hospital. He actually went to Buckingham Palace, I think it was, and met the King, and went on an outing on the river as well. So part of what the hospital was doing was trying to keep the patients busy and entertained, to keep their minds off being ill. So he really seemed to have quite a jolly time there.
Oh, well, that is nice to hear about somebody who had a good time as well. And I mean, and now there is a plaque outside Endell Street. I mean, there's something, because I mean the building doesn't exist anymore. It was part of the old Covent Garden Workhouse, wasn't it? But it's in the centre of London. It's not very far from where LSE is, as you know. And there is a kind of plaque on the floor with the names of Flora Murray and Louise Garrett Anderson. But they are recorded. You went to York Minster, is that right, recently? And you saw their names on the big kind of memorial to the women in the war. What does that look like? Whereabouts is it in York Minster?
Yeah, I just went to York Minster, finally got there, been meaning to go there for quite a long time. So the big cathedral in York. And in there, there's a memorial to all the women who died in the First World War. And what it is kind of wooden doors. So the doors open and it's got the names inside of them. And one of the doors is women who had worked in hospitals. So it gives the name of the 5 women who worked at Endell Street, well, 6 altogether, 5 who died during the flu pandemic and 1 other doctor. Their names are written in the wooden plaque to remember their lives. And yeah, it was really moving to be able to see that finally.
That's really interesting, because it's just thinking about how we remember these things. Because obviously we remember the war, but very few people know that much about the influenza epidemic that followed the war. And although a lot more people died in it than the war, I think that's right, isn't it? And worldwide, actually, probably now a lot of the medicines that we have would stop that happening because of antibiotics and things. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for your time, Wendy. That's great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, Debbie.